So picture this, you're at the Dollar Tree, you're getting snacks, maybe even a birthday card, when all of a sudden, bam, you put a fat bag of nickels and quarters on the counter. People start tensing, the cashier's a little upset, the guy behind you, fuming. Why? Because paying with coins is an act of social deviance. Today, we're gonna go ahead and go into the wild experiment of sociology and figure out why paying in coins upsets people so much. So, why do people get so upset when you use an excessive amount of coins? Well, in order to figure that out, we have to conduct a little experiment. So, we did just that. Me and another student at Texas A&M, Olivia, conducted our own experiment to figure out why that's the case. It was so simple, so ordinary, that it was super creative. Can you guess it? We bought a bunch of stuff using excessive amount of coins. Creative, right? Okay, let me explain our experiment. Follow me.
Hi, I'm Olivia, and here's how we did our experiment. In this experiment, we tested two hypotheses. So hypothesis number one was that individuals would be perceived as deviant if they paid for goods entirely in coins. And then hypothesis number two was that bystanders would have a more negative reaction to our deviant act based on the obscurity of the items that we purchased. And both of these were tested with a qualitative design. So now I just want to take a second and review our research design. So both experiments were done at Dollar Tree. One was done in the afternoon, one was done at the evening. And this was to see if time of day had any effect on the way people perceived our deviant behaviors. So we wanted to do one experiment during peak business hours in the afternoon, and then one experiment in the evening where it's kind of quieter. Both times we spent about $8. The first time we purchased normal items, so just some snacks and some drinks. And the second time we purchased really weird items. But like I said, both times about $8 were spent.
All right, now that you saw what our hypothesis and our experiment was, you're probably wondering how the experiment actually went down. So why don't I show you? Howdy, I'd like to buy these snacks and drinks for $8, please. And I only have coins to pay for them, so I'm gonna go ahead and take these out. Alright, as you can have told from experiment 1, the person behind me was not happy about what I was doing. They were folding their arms, they were rolling their eyes at me, they were sighing and making a bunch of upset noises just to prove that they did not like what I was doing. They were doing anything in their path to make me feel bad about what I was doing, and all I was doing is just paying in coins. Now, well, that was the one person in the room. The other person in the room is also the cashier. So whenever I originally went up to the cashier and pulled out the bag of coins, they didn't really seem to mind. They just kept on scanning the items and ignoring anything I was doing. They counted it out with me, and they just said, "Have a good day." So according to the cashier's point of view, they didn't really seem to mind. Everything else to them was just like a regular day, but to the customer, it was just another nuisance in the way. It was almost an obstacle that was keeping them from checking out and getting out of the store faster. But what I wanted to know what would happen if we bought a bunch of random items that kind of stood out a little more than just regular chips or sodas. And so what we bought this time was a happy birthday card, a pregnancy test, a mug that said Saturday nights are for the girls, and a motivational sign. And so we wanted to see what would happen if that would draw out a little more deviant activity than the first experiment, and here's how that one went. Howdy, I like to buy this birthday card, this pregnancy test, this mug that says Saturday nights are for the girls, and this motivational sign. And I only have coins to pay for them, so... As you can have seen from experiment number 2, it was completely different from experiment number 1. The first thing that was completely different was the reactions. It was super positive and not negative like the first experiment. There was no eye rolling or arms folding or sighing in frustration. It was completely filled with laughing and stories about how they wish that their kid would spend their coins that they had saved up and buy things like how I was doing. But that's how both experiments went down, but there's only one thing we still need to figure out. Alright, the last thing that we need to go over is the theories that we use to commit this devious act. And those are going to be explained by Olivia, and that's going to be explained right now.
So there were 3 theories we related our experiment to. The first being Emile Durkheim's functionalism, the second being Howard Becker's labeling theory, and the third being Ronald Akers' social learning theory. Just as a quick review, functionalism views deviance as behavior that violates social norms, whereas these negative responses are necessary to keep a cultural equilibrium because it reinforces social norms. In our case, paying for coins disrupted social order. It also caused inconvenience to the cashier and to the bystanders, which demonstrates how kind of diverging from social expectations can be perceived as deviant behavior. On some really interesting literature that relates to functionalism and our experiment. So in 2021, a group of researchers studied how subjects responded to insults being hurled at them while the insulter was looking them into the eye. This is really interesting because staring into someone's eyes can be really revealing and communicative, and it suggests that the behavior can heighten the awareness and self of others. In this study, the focal point was embarrassment because it relates to how individuals perceive each other, and it can also be measured immediately, which is really helpful. So researchers questioned whether eye contact induces an embarrassed response in those who are breaking social norms. Ultimately, the research suggested that those who behave badly while making eye contact kind of experience more negative emotions, which can act as a deterrent to breaking these social norms. This aligns with our current study because paying with an excessive amount of coins also evokes a feeling of embarrassment, and these behaviors of those forced to count the coins would be a deterrent to that deviant behavior. So the second theory we focused on is labeling theory, which states that it's society's label that defines an action as deviant. With this label, an individual's status in society does become tainted, which often leaves the individual to behave in ways that correspond with their label. So they are labeled this way and they feel they become that identity, basically. In our case, observing the reaction of bystanders demonstrates the process of a person being labeled as deviant, and in theory, this person will act accordingly to their label if the deviant behavior continues. For our research, we analyzed 2 literature reviews that relate to labeling theory. So the first one was a study that was done in 2015. Researchers analyzed secondary data that was collected with surveys among inmates in a Nebraska prison. In these surveys, participants were instructed to select one of 4 identities that they felt best resembled them. The 4 identities being violent identity, addict identity, thief identity, and straight identity. Of the 4 self-identifying labels, the label of thief suggested that a person was less likely to stop committing crimes among their release from prison, but those who identified with the straight label, meaning they don't see themselves as criminal at all, were 2.3 times more likely to say they intended to change their behavior following their release from prison. Ultimately, for our study, this suggests that individuals who self-identify with deviant identities are not likely to stop committing crimes, which relates to what I had mentioned earlier about those who are given a label of deviance ultimately become that label. For our second lit review, we found a study from 2017 that tested the effect of stigmatizing language on the public perception of people with a criminal record. The language used to describe them significantly influences their public persona and their likelihood of future criminal behavior. So in this study, respondents of the survey were given descriptions of individuals with a criminal record using language of crime first, which means a convicted criminal, or person first, which means a person who committed a crime. And from here, they were asked to rate the likelihood of that person committing future crimes, so 1 being not as likely and 7 being very likely. The results of this study did find that being given the label of criminal becomes your master status, which really influences social exclusion decisions. Finally, the last theory we reviewed was social learning theory. This suggests that deviance is learned through the interactions with peers. In the context of our research, bystander reactions to the coin payments acted as informal reinforcements, which was expected to either normalize or discourage the deviant behavior of the subject of our study. So, in relation to social learning theory, we found a study that was done in Sweden, which challenged notions about delinquent behavior of young girls. Before the study was done, it was thought that girls who committed crimes had trouble developing relationships and usually committed offenses on their own. In this study, data was collected with an interview of 9 adolescent females who were sentenced to youth service, and the idea was to discover what participants thought about the crimes they committed. In these interviews, several topics were addressed, such as the views of participants of their delinquency, the views of their sentence, the views of what led to their delinquent behavior, and the views of the future. Ultimately, it was found that deviant behavior, whether it breaks social norms or escalates into criminal acts, may serve as a form of socialization. In our case, paying in coins became a learned deviant act, not because of the act itself, but because of the reactions it perceived.
Alright, so here's the kicker. This whole study shows that deviance isn't about what you do. It's about who's watching, when they're watching, or honestly how inconvenient they feel from it. Coins aren't deviant, but if you drop them at high noon with 5 people in line, you might be considered a social outlaw. So, what's the lesson here? If you're gonna buy stuff with coins, do it at 7 p.m. And maybe, just maybe, don't buy a pregnancy test and a mug in the same transaction. But if you're gonna do that, do it with a smile. Own it. You're not deviant, you're just misunderstood. Or maybe you're just really annoying.